and you're used to this, so I'm going to just hand it straight over to you. So off you go.
All right, thank you, thank you. So this began in 2001, and Rosemary was doing a lecture, in December of 2001 here in New York City. So one morning prior to a few months before, my friend Alan had told me that he heard that Rosemary, or found out that Rosemary was coming to town to do one of her lectures. And he wanted to know if I wanted to accompany him, to this. I said, absolutely, for sure. I'd seen Rosemary before in other events prior. So it was a big surprise that he would come up to me that way, because Alan was a bit of a skeptic. So it was unusual to even have this experience, and he come running to me one morning saying, oh, Rosemary's here, I'll get tickets, we'll go see her. I said, okay, that's interesting. And
can I just ask you, where were you? I mean, which city were you in when this was going on?
I live and work in New York City, in Manhattan.
Okay.
So Alan was my supervisor, but we were also very good friends, as well. And I had told him about seeing Rosemary in the past, and I've always had an interest, and I work with spirit also as well. So he knew about this, but he was always very skeptical about it. So that's why it was so interesting when he just came practically running up to me saying that he saw that Rosemary was in town and he wanted to get tickets to go see her. I said, okay, that's unusual, but it was delightful. I said, yes, absolutely. So it's for December of 2001. So there was a Saturday morning, early in December, and we went, and Rosemary was there, obviously, she was doing her lecture and her events there, and describing how to work with spirit and how people should be open to this, etc., working with Grey Eagle. And then it was towards the very end of the event, and Rosemary had done a number of readings already for various members of the audience. Then suddenly she started looking behind where Alan and I were sitting. And there was these two young men sitting behind us. And then she's saying, I'm being directed to come to speak to both of you here. And then she said, I have a young lady in spirit here that wishes to speak to you. And then she started communicating with the young lady. And the young lady gave a description of herself, her personality, what she looked like. There was a young lady in her early 20s, as Rosemary saw her as they were talking. And a beautiful young lady with long brown hair, very sweet in personality, very kind. And so she gave the personality for both young men to recognize, which they did. Then she started saying about one morning that she went to work and that she worked at the World Trade Center. And it was the morning of 9/11.
Wow.
So obviously the young lady worked in one of the towers, and she was there in the morning in her office. And then suddenly she heard the building, a big boom happen, and that she felt the building shake. And it was tremendous. She said, oh my God, what's happening here? And then it started to shake a number of times. And people, of course, started getting panicky and etc. And some people started running, obviously, from the space. And she was there. It happened very quickly, obviously. And then she started seeing the smoke started to form from the ceiling. And lots of gray, billowing smoke started to come into the place. And then she was frightened, obviously, because she could feel the building start to shake and move. And she was in a state of panic, obviously. And at that point, she couldn't run any faster anywhere from there. So she was describing through Rosemary that she hid under a desk. By this time, the boys knew that this was accurate information because Rosemary had described her personality, where she worked, etc. They knew who this was. And she was describing her fear. And then this big smoke started happening more and more. The billowing smoke started filling up the space. And the building was shaking more and more. And then she could feel something give way within the space. And then the ceiling started to crumble. And more of this loud noise. And the building was shaking because it was starting to collapse. And then the floor beneath, it started to collapse as well. She was terribly frightened. She thought, I'm going to die here, obviously. And just before everything started to hit, she said that all of a sudden, from the ceiling, she saw like a light, appear above. And that she saw these angels, come down from that light, these two big angels with wings come down. And they took her, they embraced her. They literally embraced her and they took her up. So as the building finally gave way and collapsed, she was in their arms already. And she was already rising. So she said that she felt no pain. She no loss of consciousness. She was taken up, and she was taken up high into the light.
So let me, if I hate to interrupt you because I'm sort of listening here, but for the people listening to this story, let's be clear, this young lady was telling this story, describing this through me.
Yes.
And
yes.
I was then relating all of this to these two young men.
Exactly.
Two young men, is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. Carry on, because I'm hooked.
So she described that, that she felt no pain, no more fear. There was no suffering. And she just was taken up safely and comforted, into the light. So both young men, of course, were very affected by this, and they were crying, obviously. And as well as my friend Alan and I, we were also in tears, and a number of the people in the audience, because there was quite a large number of people there. They were all affected by this. We were all very emotionally impacted, by this experience. And many people were crying, as well, because hearing something like this and with so much detail, and with the young lady and the description of who she was, how she looked, her personality, which was confirmed by both young men who knew her very, very well, because one of the young men was named John, and he was her fiancé. And the other one was a very good friend of both John and the young lady, as well. So they knew that who this was from the description of her personality, from the way she looked, from her age, that indeed this was definitely her. And hearing about the experience, because that's what happened, that unfortunately she died as one of the victims of the World Trade Center disaster.
I've got goosebumps, really. But I know that you have a little bit more to this story, because I think you mentioned earlier when we had our little chat just before we started this, that you I think you had an opportunity to talk to these young men after the event ended. So the event ends, and yes. I've still got goosebumps. I'm loving this story.
So obviously we were all affected by this and emotional, and the event came to a conclusion. We started leaving, the ballroom, and both young men were outstanding out front, and Alan and I got to meet with them, and we got to speak with them. I asked them immediately, how are you feeling? Because such a tremendous experience. And we could see they were still very affected, obviously. They said, no, we're fine, we're okay. It's just mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing, because they weren't sure about why they came there in the first place. They just had heard about Rosemary, and I guess they were hoping that they'd get some connection somehow, from this. And sure enough, it happened at the very last people to be read, that day. So they were very emotionally affected by this. But they were both relieved to hear. And then we learned that the young lady's name was Lynette. So they were very relieved and very at peace to hear that Lynette had made it, that she was still alive, just in another way, but she still existed, and that she was fine, and that she was at peace. And because afterward, Rosemary, after detailing the event, that happened with her, you said to both boys that, first of all, she's fine, and she wants you to know that she's fine. You don't have to suffer, for her loss, in this way anymore. You don't have to grieve to such a tremendous extent, that she's okay, and she's watching over both of you, all of you, and that she wishes peace, for you, and wants you to be happy, and wants you to continue living and just live your lives, and do everything that you have to do. Just because she's no longer there doesn't mean that you don't have to continue. You live your life, you're here, and she will always be with them and always watching over, them. And they don't have to be living in a sense of wonder, what happened, how did she suffer? It must have been terrible to go through such a thing. That for her, luckily, because the angels were there, and she detailed it so beautifully, that she didn't suffer at the very end, and that she was taken up, into the higher realms, and that she's fine and lovely and at peace. And she wishes peace for both of them. So they were relieved. They were relieved, and you could see the sense of tranquility and peace, with them, even though they were still shaken up because it was a tremendous experience. And both boys, because they were in their early 20s, 21 or so, this was a whole new thing for them. They had never experienced this type of thing ever before. They weren't really such believers of this, but for some reason they were drawn to come to see you, that day. So it was a lot for them to have to be exposed to and to deal with, but they were at peace.
Okay, so I love this story. I do actually remember a little bit about I don't remember all of the messages by any means, but I do remember being, I think it was at the New York Marriott or something like that we were doing these workshops. Now, you've told me that you were able to talk to these two young men afterwards, which is fantastic.
Yes.
I also found out something else that is fantastic that you do is that you every year on, I don't know if it's September 11th, but you put up this story on your website.
Yes.
That is fantastic. You told me it's because you don't want people to forget. And of course, we don't want people to forget. Now, I have a lovely, hopefully, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I hope that you were inspired by this experience yourself. My question to you is, can you tell us a little bit about how you were affected by this experience? There you were, you're in this room. You told me earlier that your friend Alan had also received a message from a young friend of his who died of AIDS.
Yes.
Maybe you'll come and tell us that story another time. But so here you are, you've watched your friend Alan, he's had a message from his friend, and you've watched these two young men behind you who had an amazing experience, because we all know that 9/11 was a really shattering experience, I think, for the world, really. Tell me, you spoke to the young men afterwards. Now you're going home, you're talking to your friend Alan, and now you're going home and so on. Tell me, how did you feel? How did it impact you? What was your feeling? Has it affected you? Did it inspire you? What I want to know, what you're one in the audience, you haven't received a personal message, but yet you've received all of this. Can you tell us how it felt for you, being that fly on the wall, so to speak, listening to all of this? Can you tell us how that felt for you?
It gave me confirmation about spirit more and more. I had always been open to spirit since I was a child, in one form or another. It took me a while to really start to believe more fully in this. So early in the 2000s, I was really opening up more to this than ever before. And just the way the entire experience happened from the start, with Alan inviting me all of a sudden out of nowhere. And it was like, it's like a little light went off in me, said, there's something going on here. I didn't know what exactly, but there was a little inkling of something already there. I said, there's something going on. There's a reason why, obviously, this is happening in this way. Fine, go along with it. And just being there, and I'd seen you prior in other events before, so it was nothing new for me. So I know that you could connect with this way and give all this evidence to so many people. But it gave me more confirmation, especially because it happened, first of all, for my friend Alan directly, number one, which opened him up more to believing in these things, but also for the two young men, and seeing all this happening before me and getting a feeling of, look how real this all is. Look at all this confirmation. Look at all the healing that's taking place here for so many people here, not just for Alan, not just for John, Lynette's, fiance, and for her friend, but for the others who also received readings that day with such clarity and such accuracy, and that people knew that this was so. And if you're sensitive, it's more than just hearing about it, you feel it. You feel it.
Can I just ask you this question? Because, we get a lot of people who come to see somebody like myself, or anyway, people who are mediums. And the biggest complaint that we hear is, and especially from the skeptics, the biggest complaint is, well, they never tell you anything. They never give you any details. And it is the biggest complaint that we hear. And of course, it feeds the skeptics, because very often, we watch people do this and there are no details and so on. So I'm very, very careful and make sure that I can give as much detail as I possibly can. So I want to ask you this. What would you say to those who are skeptical, who say, well, they never give you any details, they never give you, what would you say to that?
You have to go to the right person, obviously, and you have to speak with others and get recommendations about people who've had experiences with people who do provide that type of evidence, that part of communication, where they can give you complete evidence of that individual on the other side, in the other dimension, wherever they may be, by describing their personality, describing their age, let's say, describing what they may look like, describing the experiences that they had in the past, what their relationship is to you. Exactly. Other things that how did they pass away? Also to give that kind of detail that there's no way that this person could possibly know unless they're communicating with that actual individual in spirit. That's how you know that there are people that do this for real.
I'm so glad that you said that, because my aim, my goal is actually not to please those people who come to see me, not to please those people who are in the audience. My aim and my job is to be the voice of the spirit world. And I feel that if I am relaying or somehow passing messages from the spirit world, I know perfectly well that there is not one person in the spirit world who does not want to give the details. They want to give you the detail because they know how important it is for someone to believe this is really me. Mm-hmm. And so, it's very important for me as the voice of the spirit world to make sure. And I think the real evidence that we have is in the smallest and the most inconsequential detail. That who cares about that except the person you're giving the message to, who really that resonates so much with them. So is there anything that you would finally, I could talk to you forever and ever. Is there anything finally, because we do have to cut this short, is anything that you would like to add to this before we end this interview, Dee?
It was an incredible experience because it gave such comfort for everyone, and even for me. Even though I did not directly receive a reading from a person on the other side, through you and Grey Eagle that day, but just seeing all of this happening around me and seeing all these people receiving all this with such clarity, such detail, it offered me tremendous confirmation that indeed we do go on after this, that we don't have to be so afraid of death when our time comes, because we're going to go on in another way, in another form, but our consciousness goes beyond, this physical, world. So we don't have to be afraid that we're no longer going to exist. And that was very comforting to me.
Well, Dee, unfortunately, we we have to stop. But maybe you'd like to come back another time and tell us of your experience with Alan, and that we would love to hear about his message too. I would really like to thank you for coming on and volunteering for doing this. You probably know that it is our 25th anniversary of the first publication of The Eagle and the Rose, which is on the 19th, which is in 2 days' time, or 1.5 days, as my grandson would say now. We are celebrating The Eagle and the Rose, and to hear stories like this, and particularly, we know a story about 9/11 is something that we're all really eager to hear about, because so many throughout the world were affected by it. So thank you so very much, Dee, for coming along and giving us this testimony. We really very much appreciate it. And I personally thank you so very much for doing this for us. Okay, everybody. Well, that's it for now. We'll be doing this again, I'm sure, with other people. And I think we'll have Dee back again, because I want to hear the story about Alan. Don't you want to hear the story about Alan? In the meantime, please, all of you out there, have a very, very blessed rest of the day. Dee, thank you very much once again.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.